What do you call chronic fatigue syndrome that you can just push through? Misdiagnosis. So the worst thing about chronic fatigue syndrome is that you can't push through. It's chronic by definition. Anything that easy would never end up getting labelled as chronic fatigue syndrome. So it is a syndrome, so it's not a specific disease, so who knows what's going on? Who knows how many underlying diseases get put under the umbrella? But they all share characteristics. And from what specialists have told me and from what I've observed myself, you can't push through. And that is the worst thing, in my opinion. Now, to really understand why, you need some context and explanation. So I'll go into that now. So the first thing to understand is, if you don't do enough in chronic fatigue syndrome, you stagnate and you don't get better. And if you do a bit too much, you're just constantly exhausted with no improvement. You don't get better. But if you do way too much, you get worse. And that's a very difficult balancing act because there's no handy readout. You don't look at your wrist and see, a new tattoo each day showing you how much you can do or how you're tracking. You always feel fatigued. You wake up fatigued, you go to sleep fatigued. You always feel fatigued. That doesn't necessarily mean anything to whether you're doing the right amount for recovery. It's very difficult to gauge. The second thing to note for context is that life has obligations. And a lot of the time it's a false economy not to fulfill those obligations. And sometimes they're not moral obligations, sometimes they're just things that are going to happen that take energy if you don't do another thing that takes energy. I've got many ready examples. For example, I have children and I owe it to them to look after them as best I can, even if it kills me. And sometimes it feels like it might. The important thing to understand is my choice is not don't spend energy on them or spend energy on them. It's spend energy on them in a positive way, or they start playing up in destructive or antisocial ways that I can't ignore, and then have to deal with that. So I'm spending energy in a negative way. There's no option provided by life as a father that says don't spend energy on your kids unless you're one of those people who leaves their children. No. So one thought that might have popped into your head is, well, how can this guy afford to make a YouTube channel, right, if he's got so little energy? Well, first of all, I've cut this to the bone, Apart from a little bit of effort setting up the channel and making a channel logo, there's no editing, there's no particular presentation, quality control. I just talk into my phone camera and upload it after taking notes for complex topics. And even that, you're right, is a drain. And it is energy that I don't particularly have. But you know what I have no energy for as well? Compulsively thinking about these topics for hours and hours and then having it loop because I haven't really got a proper outlet for it. So even this sort of low production value YouTube channel is exhausting to put a few videos up on. But it's not so exhausting as having no outlet for all of these things that I need to express. So this could actually be a net positive in terms of energy expended compared to the alternative, but it's still going to be an expenditure. Another example would be meditation, right? Oh, you've got all of these, intrusive thoughts and you can't get rid of them and they keep you awake for hours. You should meditate. Yeah, no shit. I'm sitting in the cupboard that I converted into a meditation room on a meditation stool that I will meditate on after I finish this video. But it's not a magic wand that magically fixes all of your mental distractions, especially if you've got mental illness. And it also takes energy. I actually had a serious conversation with my treating specialist about trying to budget energy to increase meditation sessions from 10 minutes to 16 minutes. Because that's what it takes. It is exhausting. You just don't realize it if you don't have chronic fatigue syndrome or something similar. If you've got a lot of capacity, these things don't really count. You can just add half an hour of meditation to your morning, and there's nothing but discipline and technique and mindset getting in your way, but it's not so for chronic fatigue. So yeah, like if I didn't meditate, it would be even worse. Like that kind of distraction would just be ever present and constantly using up my energy. And when I get lost in those bouts of mental energy, I start pacing, and that's terribly energy wasteful. I can't afford that. And so I meditate. It's costly, but I don't have a non-costly option, which is my whole point. And then a similar thing for therapy, right? You can spend money from your depleting savings and spend the time to, commute to a psychologist's office or maybe not psychological therapy. It might be who's managing your exercise therapy for chronic fatigue syndrome. And if you don't, you are just going to spend more energy flailing around because you don't know how to recover effectively. So again, it's expensive, but what are you going to do? Something more expensive? So I hope that fully illustrates that point. So the other thing, I think I may not have alluded this already. Ambition, drive, willpower, work against you. They are not your friend when you have ambitions outside of your actual capacity. Chronic fatigue syndrome doesn't care what you want to do with life. You have the capacity that you have, and you have to accept that. And that's very important. So people's advice, especially like advice tailored for normal people who don't have any limitations apart from their mindset, are to just improve your mindset and that will fix everything, right? You'll suddenly be more productive, whatever. But even the smart ones of them will not advise you to suddenly go whole hog and do way more than you're currently capable of. They'll tell you to build up slowly. But even the smart ones are assuming that you have the capacity of a normal person and don't have, say, chronic fatigue syndrome. Because you can't just push yourself to new heights. So if you're trying to find a way out, you're constantly going to be getting bad advice. And that's undermining to your morale and your confidence. You become full of self-doubt because you don't want to have this condition, and you may even convince yourself that you don't have the condition to your great detriment, and I'll talk more about that later. You can't do better than expert advice. If you've been given graded exercise therapy, as I have, you were given that because it's the only thing that was shown to help when they did actual proper studies. That's why they give you that. It's not because it always works for everybody. It's not because it's easy. It's sure not easy. It's just, that's what you got. Take it or leave it. Now, my advice, and let's be very clear, I am not a doctor, and I don't know anything about your circumstances. This is not a substitute for medical advice. But as a kind of friendly advice, if you're a new sufferer of chronic fatigue syndrome, don't push it. I remember talking to a local man who had fibromyalgia, and when I told him my story about how I thought I was better and had a huge fatigue crash, he said, yeah, that's pretty common. I think everyone with these sorts of conditions has a story like that. So this is a very common pitfall, okay? Learn from our mistakes. Recovery looks like a very gradual, wobbly, straight line. It is not a straight line and then you sprint the last bit. That actually looks like you go sort of straight line, sprint the last bit. Oh no, actually you crash right down worse than you were before. And you don't try and do steep upward slant as your plan for recovery, because what that looks like is up, down, up, down, up, down. You're just not going to get anywhere. That's the first habit they try and get you out of if you have chronic fatigue syndrome. So, I should give you the full anecdote that I'm referring to, which is that I was recovering using graded exercise therapy. It was taking years, but I was recovering. And I managed to convince myself during a period of upheaval and grief and trauma, and just needing to do things that were not within my capacity. And I found that I could, in desperation, do those things. And I used that to convince myself that, I was just being lazy. I was underestimating my capacity. I'm basically better now. I was like taking things that my exercise physiologist had said out of context to justify this, and I convinced myself that I could just push it. I could do all of the heavy exercise I need to not get osteoporosis later in life, which is a medical concern that I just had to put on the shelf and is now on the shelf again. Because guess what? I pushed myself for 3 to 4 months, and I had a crash so bad that I cannot sustain everyday life and improve. So I've now had 15 months with no recovery because I was foolish enough to assume that I could just sprint the last stretch. So I recommend you don't ever do that, because there's no saying that where you end up after that is going to be as good as where you are now, especially if you're coping at all with your limitations. So last piece of advice is for people who know sufferers of chronic fatigue syndrome. And yeah, the best bit of advice is give them the benefit of the doubt that they actually have chronic fatigue syndrome. You know, maybe their doctors might know what they're talking about. You know, don't just assume that it's some other thing that you already understand. Have the humility to accept that something outside your experience might be actually the case, and that your easy, obvious solutions are so easy and obvious that they might have already been considered and rejected for good reason. Okay, they're not lazy. A lot of people with chronic fatigue are extremely ambitious, and they just get cut down out of their ambitions. If someone was actually like, I don't know, unambitious, lazy, useless dull bludger, and they got CFS, no one would notice, would they? It's people who have full lives that they're trying to make fuller who really feel it, because you already got limits in life just as a normal person. And so you, excuse the cockatoos, I couldn't even hear myself think, let alone expect you not to hear them. But what was I saying? Yeah, ambitious people are already limited, and then they push themselves to the greatest heights that they can, and then they get CFS and they can't even do what they were doing before, and it sucks. So, you know, have a bit of compassion. Like, it's not easy, right? And do not suggest that they push through. Do not suggest that this is just a matter of mindset, and if they just think about it differently, it's going to go away. That's just playing into their bad advice that they're giving themselves, because they want that. They want it just to be a trick. We want it to just be, a misunderstanding. Oh, well, I wish I had realized that this was just a misunderstanding before, but at least now I know it is. But it's not. There's a saying that reality is that which remains when you stop believing in it. And I know from first-hand experience, you stop believing in chronic fatigue syndrome, it doesn't go away, it comes back with a vengeance. And just an anecdote regarding that is when I saw Australia's leading specialist and talked about how I'd heard people online talking about just pushing through and, you know, with extreme exercise and journaling about it as a solution to chronic fatigue, he said, and I quote, "Madness." Okay? This is not endorsed by people who actually understand the condition the best of anybody. Okay? And that's what this video is about. Don't push it. You cannot push through chronic fatigue syndrome. Don't try it. You probably do have something to lose by pushing through it if you have any capacity at all. Again, not a doctor, but I have talked to some.